Hello everyone, this is your instructor Dr. Q here with this week's discussion on the elements of literature. And this is indeed a follow-up from the previous week in which we looked at character archetypes as defined by Vladimir Prop, and we looked at the basic narrative structure. We looked at Freytag's triangle and consider the question of linearity versus non-linearity. Now, this week we will move on to discuss setting or the role of setting in literature. We will consider themes, or at least some themes, as you very well might be aware. There are almost countless themes that literature can discuss, and so we'll be looking at a few of them, focusing on binaries specifically, the question of themes that might be diametrically opposed to each other. We will be looking at the question of story versus narrative, and we will be considering narrative voice. Let's focus a little bit on the question of setting. And while this might seem to be something daunting, especially when we're talking about longer stories like epics and so on, um, for the purposes of our course, we want to focus on two specific questions regarding setting. That is, question number one, is the setting one that is physical or psychological? If you consider the story Hatchet, for example, that story is set in the woods. It's a story of character versus nature. And most of the action happens on a physical space. In that case, the setting is physical. It doesn't necessarily reflect the mental condition of the character, nor does it serve as a catalyst for some kind of internal conflict or introspection. It is simply a place in which the character exists and which moves in which the story is moved along. However, other stories could have the setting be a psychological one. And this could take two different forms. The setting as a psychological space could be a story that takes place in the mind of a character. This usually happens when a character is dreaming or when a character is embarking on what we call a vision quest. Alternatively, the setting as a psychological reflection of the character is something that we see as the character grows and changes. And so the setting reflects the changes of the character. So that you get a better example, let me go ahead and pull up Pamela. It's an epistolary novel. And it reads, I, it starts with Dear Father and Mother. It's again an epistolary novel. I have great trouble and some comfort to acquaint you with. And uh, the letter goes on explaining what this great trouble and some comfort might be. So Pamela or Virtue Rewarded is an example of an epistolary novel, and I will link this on our lesson in case that you want to see what it's like in depth. Right. So an example of the second person narrative is one that speaks directly to you, the reader, and we have already seen an example in class, if you'll remember. The short story Girl breaks the fourth wall and speaks to you, the reader, directly. Go by Jamaica Kincaid. Um, but perhaps a more interesting example, I think, is Aura by Carlos Fuentes. The opening few lines of which reads as follows. You read that advertisement. An offer of this nature isn't seen every day. You read and reread the advertisement. Seems targeted towards you. Distracted, you leave your cigarette inside the cup of tea that you have been drinking in this cheap and dirty cafe. Now, that seems a little bit different from Girl. Why? Because in Girl, the narrator is speaking directly to you as if they were having a conversation with you, the reader. In this story, however, Carlos is telling you not just statements via conversation, but it's also telling you how you are feeling. It's telling you what you are doing. While Jamaica Kincaid's story does not do this, and gives you the freedom of imagining where you are, who you are, and what you're doing, Carlos doesn't take these risks. Carlos tells you, here's what you're doing, and here's what you, the reader, has to think. So this is a bit of an extreme example of the second person narrative, and I should note this is a translation of a story originally published in Spanish. So the third person is the one that we're all familiar with. The narrator is not the protagonist. There is no use of I or you, at least in the narration, although characters certainly do use those terms in conversations. Uh, the third person narrative describes the feelings of the characters. Uh, and you can have a narrator that knows everything or a narrator that has only partial information. All these elements change from story to story. So what's going to happen now is you are going to go to the class forums and you are going to do some writing activities based on what we've done so far. Right? Essentially, in a narrative of your choosing, you're going to post a short discussion about binary themes and narrative perspective. So you will have until next week to do this. I will see you on the forums. And so if you consider the rhyme of the ancient mariner, that is an example where the setting as a psychological reflection of the mental state, or rather the spiritual state, of the character can be seen. The challenges that the space itself, that the sea throws at the mariner, the changes in the tone of the world, are a reflection of the mariner's inner state. And another thing that we will want to ask about in regards of setting is that of mood. Is the setting one that appears to be appealing and friendly, or that is dark and broody? Is it a setting that changes moods or tones? And if we consider the short story Araby, that is an example of a story that has a setting that changes in mood. Araby, the bazaar, throughout most of the story is painted as this magical place of wonder, but when the protagonist actually gets there, you notice that the mood of the setting is starkly different. Now, if you'll flip to your books, on your books to page 297, you will see a few questions that you might want to ask yourself when you are analyzing setting. And some of these questions are: number one, what is the story's location? So where is the story being said? And by extension, when? What mood does the setting create? Does the setting create some kind of anxiety? Is the mood of the setting one that encourages fright or happiness or frustration? We might want to think about how the setting is a window into the character. In other words, how does the setting reflect what the characters are feeling? And the short story, The Storm, is a great example of this. We need to think about how setting shapes the character. In other words, not whether the setting is a reflection of the character, but rather if the setting is acting on the character itself. And Hatchet is a great example of this. We need to think about whether the setting is itself a character, and to some extent, The Storm is also an example of this. I will briefly run through the remaining questions about setting. We need to think about whether the setting is an expression of the story's theme, whether the setting is a representation of a particular physical region. We need to think about the physical and social environment of the setting. We need to think about whether the environment and weather itself is a part of the setting. And we need to think about the general social conditions in the era that is being depicted in the story. And so with those questions, you should be ready to tackle a setting analysis for your paper. Now, we do need to be aware of the differences between story and narrative. Right? Story is the actual series of events being told through the medium. What happens first, second, and last. It is the what. What is being told is the story. Narrative, however, are the structural elements of the story. In other words, narrative is the how. How is the story being told? This includes chronospatial elements, meaning elements that have to do with both space and time. They have to do with the organization and structure of the story, the theme, the mood, and so on. All these other things that are tangential to the sequence of events are the question of narrative for the purposes of this course. If you consider, for example, the story of Batman, the origin story. There we go. The story of Batman has been told several times, and in each and every iteration, we have a similar sequence of events. We have Mr. Wayne, Bruce Wayne, as a youth, sees his parents getting murdered, and as he grows up, he uses his wealth to become Batman. And the story of Batman has been told several times. We have the funky 80s, 60s, 80s Batman. We have the cartoon Batman, the comic books Batman, the Dark Knight Batman. We have Batfleck. We have the Batman video games. And even though the Batman story is the same in all of these iterations, in all cases we have Batman fighting the Joker, or the penguin or the random bad guy of the day, Raj Al Ghul. Each of the stories is told differently. Those differences are the narrative differences, which again have to do with the tone, the style, the organization, the aesthetics, the sequence of events, etc., the way that they are organized. So I'll go back one slide so that we can briefly talk about themes, specifically binaries. All stories, all poems, all texts touch on themes. And some of the better crafted ones look at themes as binaries. Some stories explore the idea of love, but do so while also contrasting it with hatred. The question of heroism, righteousness, or just in general what we define as light is often contrasted with darkness. And texts that explore questions of social control are often juxtaposed with questions of chaos or panic. Questions of freedom often go hand in hand with imprisonment. The reason being that an exploration of a theme, edifying and worthy as it might be, is ultimately incomplete if we don't explore the opposites in a text. Consider The Matrix, for example. That is a film that tackles questions of control, but juxtaposed with control, there is the question of chaos. The Matrix is designed as a system to keep people under control. So, what happens when that system is destroyed? That is briefly explained when we see Sion, when we see the Matrix from the outside, and we get a glimpse into what might happen through conversations between the architect and the oracle. Questions of light and darkness, heroism versus villainy are often brought up in Star Wars, whether we're talking about the films or the novels. It seems fairly obvious that, according to the Star Wars lore, aesthetics, and the way that the story is represented, the Jedi represent light and the Sith represent darkness. And if we look at some of the stories that we've read these past week in class, let's consider, for example, The Storm. There we see a question of control versus chaos. We see the question of lust versus, again, self-control. What happens when two individuals with a history just happen to end up locked in a room during a storm? The dynamics between the characters and the way in which the setting and the storm mirror the psychological effects of the space in the character and the way that their actions and conversations explore issues of control versus letting go is one that we see in the best short stories. So as you move forward with your papers, with your element analyses, keep an eye out for these binary themes. Another thing that we want to talk about is the question of voice. The simple way of thinking of them is that the first person voice in a story is usually found in memoirs and epistolary writing, epistolary being books that are presented as collections of letters. And this writing is done from the perspective of the writer. There is a lot of use of I. Writing in second person is incredibly rare, but it exists. It's a technique that breaks the fourth wall and talks directly to the reader. Sometimes you can find this in choose your own adventure books, but there are some short stories and poems that do use the second person voice. And the third person voice is the one that we're most familiar with. It's the omniscient narrator. It details events, describes actions, settings. More often than not, knows everything, including how the characters are feeling. So let's go ahead and look at some examples of each of these perspectives. The first person, again, this when the story is told through the view of the narrator. So an example would be, it makes sense to say from one of the stories that we've read previously, it makes sense to say, Sally didn't see the mugger coming up behind her. I tried to shout a warning, but my voice caught in my throat. That would be a first person narrative. It's a sentence written from the perspective of the narrator. It doesn't make sense, however, to say that I didn't see the mugger coming up behind me. Sally tried to shout a warning, but her voice got caught in the throat. Here, the first person narrator is not really stating what he or she might have said. Instead, the narrator is focusing on Sally. All right, so the first person voice is again one that focuses on the narrator's point of view.